Hello and welcome to a guided tour of gfxgauge. gfxgauge is a performance monitor and logger for turbocharged Subarus. It communicates with Subaru ECUs using Subaru Select Monitor Protocol, which is supported by Subarus starting with model year 1999, and displays various parameters to keep an eye on your engine performance, tune, and general health of your engine. Here I'll show you two faceplates that I have. The top one is my personal gfxgauge that I've been using for the past few weeks. It has the matte black faceplate, and the bottom one shows the very nice matte gray faceplate, which is also very clean, very nice. On the back, it's the same color. On this one, you can see there's a magnetic plate that I use for attaching to a magnetic car holder in my car. gfxgauge has an SD card slot for logging and for also displaying a splash screen on boot up. And then there's two ports on the left side. This one is the one that's used in the vehicle for connecting via the OBD port to talk to the ECU. And there's also connections through this port for connecting to external sensors like oil temperature, oil pressure, and a wideband air-fuel ratio. So that's with that port. This port here is just to provide power for programming, adjusting the settings on your gfxgauge from within the home. The other thing that the SD card can be used is for firmware upgrades. The firmware is just copied onto the SD card. When you boot up gfxgauge with a fresh firmware file on the SD card, you get prompted to upgrade, and the process is very, very straightforward, quick and painless. All right, so let's plug this in, and there we have the splash screen, and we start up in demo mode here. So the first thing I'll mention is that if you have gfxgauge and it ships starting in demo mode, to get out of demo mode, press the middle to get to the settings menu, touch the demo mode button to toggle that off, and then you'll be connecting to your vehicle. Here we're not connected to a vehicle, so that's why we're stuck at this screen. So let's go back to demo mode. So on this screen, this is what I call the gauge screen. In the center here, you have your boost, and then in the corners and on the sides, there's different values being displayed. So in the top right, you've got intake air temperature, but I can toggle that into engine coolant temperature by just tapping there. In the top left, there's three different values that can be displayed. There's the current miles per gallon, the cumulative miles per gallon display since gfxgauge started. There's the current wideband air-fuel ratio, and the current speed. And if I touch and hold on the miles per gallon value, then it's going to reset. So if I do it while we're decelerating, you'll see that we get a very high miles per gallon reading, but as more data accumulates, it's going to drop down. So on the left here, we have oil pressure. On the right, we've got oil temperature. So this is if you're connected to your external oil pressure and temperature sensors. Those can be displayed there. Then in the lower left, there's knock readings. So this one here is feedback knock correction, and it's displaying the minimum, the most negative knock correction that was applied, and also the number of knock events that occurred since gfxgauge started. And if I touch and hold on that, I can reset that back to 0. And if I tap on it, I can toggle to fine learning knock correction, which is the learned value that the ECU is applying based on different engine load and engine RPM values. And that can be sort of an indicator of long-term knock or knock trends at sort of different operating conditions. In the bottom right, we have the peak boost that's been seen since gfxgauge started. And again, if I touch and hold that, the maximum value gets reset. Now in the middle here, we have what's called the ignition advanced multiplier. So this is a multiplier that's applied to The ignition timing tables in the ECU, normally you want that to be at 1. If it drops below 1, graphics gauge will display the minimum value that's been seen. And if you want to clear that, you can touch and hold there, and it'll get cleared unless it reoccurs. Now in demo mode, it occurs every few seconds, so you'll see it reappearing there. Other actions that can be done on the screen is I can touch the bottom of the screen to go into a night mode, to reduce the brightness of the display, and touching the top goes back into day mode. And then finally, I can touch on the left or right to cycle through different screens. Now currently, graphics gauge only has 2 screens. I'm planning to add a third one soon, since there's only 2 right now, touching left or right will do the same thing. So the other screen that graphics gauge has for normal display is this graph screen, and it supports the display of up to 4 different graphs at a time. And one of the cool things about this display is if I touch in the middle, I can pause the display and then scroll back. And there'll be at least a minute of data available to scroll back. The values at the bottom get updated with whatever the values of the graph are at the right side of the screen. And one thing I'll point out here is that this red line here indicates a knock event. So if I want to see what the values were at that knock event, I can drag over to having that on the right side there, and then you can read off the values that are at the bottom. To resume, it says at the bottom if you forget, but you touch the bottom and hold, and it will resume showing live data. Now I can turn different graphs on and off. So if I touch this top one here, it'll turn off the boost graph, and the rest of the graphs will take up the space. Now here you might be wondering, well, there's 2 graphs active, 2 values active, but there's only 1 graph being shown. Well, that's because I'm showing the airfield ratio target value and the airfield ratio wideband value. In demo mode, those are exactly the same. So the graphs are right on top of each other. But because these are representing the same value, you want those to be displayed together. So that's why they take up 2 slots, basically, in the display. If I want to reset the limits on any of these graphs, all I do is, like on the other screen, I touch and hold, and then you can see that the limits are being rescaled as new data comes in. And finally, if I want to change what's being displayed, I double tap. Oops, excuse me, there we go. And so I can choose a different parameter to display there. For example, if I want to display the fine learning not correction, I can display that. Let me turn that back on there. And you can see we're getting blips of feedback or fine learning not correction every few seconds. Here we go. So I mentioned that these red lines are feedback not correction. There's also what you might have trouble seeing in the video, but the background changes depending on the status of fine learning not correction and IAM. So if there's fine learning not correction active, the background will change to a dark red. If there's an IAM value less than 1, the background will change to a dark yellow or like a mustardy color. Okay, so now let's go back to the main graph gauge screen and look some more at the settings menu. So at the top here, there's a toggle between the 2 different types of SSM protocol that graphics gauge can speak to with the ECU. K-line is supported on Subarus from 99 up to 2014. And CAN bus is supported on Subarus starting in 2008 and up. So if you have a Subaru that is older than 2008 or 2007 and earlier, it only supports CAN line. If you have a Subaru that's 2015 or newer, then it only supports CAN bus. And in between, you have a choice. CAN bus is faster, but unless you've patched your ECU using a Tactrix cable and using ECU flash, with the patch that's called Subaru CAN Enhanced RAM Parameter Logging, then you won't be able to access all parameters via CAN bus. And so if you have that patch applied, though, CAN bus is your go-to. It's faster. You'll get faster data refresh rates. And so, go with that if your ECU is patched. Log always. This is a toggle that is used to, if you want to log no matter what your engine is doing, you can turn that on and log your whole run. Demo mode we've talked about. Now options is, there's a menu with a few different options which I'll go over. The first three here are control automatic logging. So if this first option is on, then any wide open throttle, sustained wide open throttle conditions, or poles, will get automatically logged. So it detects if the throttle is 95% or more open for more than 20 samples, this will automatically start logging. It will keep logging until that stops. The nice thing about how gfxgauge records data is it's always recording the last 32 samples in an internal buffer in memory. So when one of these conditions becomes true, it will write those last 32 samples that it remembered, and then keep logging from the present into the future. So that's important for these next two where you're logging knock events, because you might want to know, well, what led up to that knock event? Was I accelerating? Did I stab the throttle? Was the boost really high? Was the air-fuel ratio off? Things like that. So you'll get a history of 32 samples leading up to that event. And so this log knock event will log that data, and then 5 seconds after the log event, anytime feedback not correction event occurs, or fine learning not correction goes below 0. This third one will log whenever the ignition advance multiplier goes below 1. This fourth option here will hide low load FBKC events. So oftentimes Subarus are known to be prone to knocking. It's sometimes called cruise knock. You'll get lots of knock events when you're cruising on the highway, the engine isn't working that hard, and those knock events aren't going to damage your engine. My car tends to do this quite a bit, and I was getting tired of seeing that knock counter rise while driving, and then I go look at the logs and see that all those knock events were around load 1 or so, 1 gram per rev, which is considered quite low. So when this is on, it'll hide any knock events less than 3 degrees when your engine load is less than 1.25 grams per revolution, which is what I have set as the low load threshold. You'll still see those in the logs, but they won't appear on the display. And, you won't have to wonder what was the actual load when that knock event occurred. Basically it's a bit of peace of mind and time savings in not having to analyze all those low load knock events. So on the next page, this top option here should be enabled if your ECU is patched to support extended parameter reading. Again, the name of that patch is Subaru CAN Enhanced RAM Parameter Logging in ECU Flash. And if your ECU is not patched and you're using CAN bus, then turn that off. There'll be some parameters that are unavailable to you, but you won't get any errors from your ECU when you try to read them. And then finally, let me go back here to the screen. You can see all these numbers here are updating very quickly, and that can sometimes be hard to read. If you want those values to update more slowly to make them easier to read, you can enable this option. So now the values are updating more slowly, making them easier to read. So the next menu here is the display menu, and so there's 2 brightness settings, as I described before, day and night. So I can control the brightness of those. If I want daytime to be dimmer, for example, I can do that. I can make nighttime, brighter or darker. Just reset that, and that's a setting that's automatically saved. Let me put that back to daytime. There we go. So now let's talk about the data menu. And this is the one that may require a bit more explanation. Obviously, because the text here is very small and it's not intended to be used while operating the vehicle. But if you're on a dyno, for example, or at the end of your drive and want to look at the maximum and minimum values of various parameters, this would be the place to do it. It's also the place to see exactly what you're reading and what you're logging from your ECU. So the little green icon on the left indicates which parameters are being logged, and all the other parameters are for display purposes only. Here, because there's more than a screen worth of parameters, you can just scroll through. And you can also see that we're reading 38 bytes of data over CAN bus, and our refresh rate is around 50-ish hertz or 50 samples per second. So to configure all this data, you would go into the menu here. So the first thing is this display interval, which we discussed before. This lets you control how quickly that data will update. So if I go to 0.2 and look here, you can see the data is updating a little bit more quickly. Go back to 0.5 there. Now to configure what we're reading and logging, you go to the configure data screen, and here's where you select what you want to read and what you want to log. So I'll go through what the parameters mean. There's air fuel correction, which is moment-to-moment correction that the ECU is applying. Air fuel learning is a longer-term correction that the ECU applies to the air fuel ratio. This air fuel ratio number 1 here is the ECU's narrowband O2 sensor estimate of the air fuel ratio. And so the stock O2 sensor can only detect whether you're at, below, or above stoichiometric ratio, or 14.7 air fuel ratio. So it's not very accurate, but it's better than nothing. So if you can display that to see what the ECU thinks your air fuel ratio is. If you've got a wideband connected to gfxgauge, then enable this, and that will be used instead. Atmospheric pressure is required to display boost, so it's always on. Battery voltage can be read. Boost, of course, is always required. Boost error can be used to tune your turbo. Closed loop and open loop fueling status is used to tune fueling. Coolant temperature, feedback not correction, fine learning not correction we've talked about. Your ignition advance multipliers is always read. Injector duty cycle is a calculated parameter. So if it uses the injector pulse width as one of the inputs. If I turn off injector pulse width, you can see that injector duty cycle automatically gets deselected. If I then select the injector duty cycle, it'll automatically turn on the things that it needs to calculate. So it's turned on the injector pulse width. Intake air temperature is one of the things on the main gauge screen. Load is a calculated parameter. It, for example, uses mass airflow. So if I deactivate that, it just turned off load. And if I turn on load, it'll turn on all the things that it needs. Mass airflow voltage, manifold pressure is again used to calculate boost. Here you can compute the different miles per gallon estimates. So if you don't have a wideband, you can use the ECU's air fuel ratio to get an estimate of your mileage, your gas mileage. If you do have a wideband, you can turn that on and get a better estimate. If you have the external oil pressure and oil temperature sensors connected, turn those on and you'll display those. And then we have engine RPM, vehicle speed, your ECU's target air fuel ratio. TD integral means turbodynamics integral, which is used for tuning your turbo. Throttle is the throttle plate opening angle. Tip in is how quickly that's changing. These are the volumetric efficiency for a 2-liter engine and a 2.5-liter engine. Let's turn that on. Come on, there we go. And then this last one here is wastegate duty cycle, which again is used for tuning your turbo. So here you can reset everything back to the factory defaults. You can choose to read everything. You can choose to read and log everything. And you can just read at the minimum and log nothing. Finally, this button here lets you reset your minimum and maximum values. So that will reset these columns in the data screen behind this menu, as well as things like your max boost in the gauge screen, your feedback, not correction count, and the limits in the graph screen. So let's do that. Now you can see that the minimum max values are reset now. I'll get back out of here and go back here, and yeah, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this tour of gfxgauge and its features. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos like this in the future. Thanks very much.